London 1830. London wore its winter like a crown of iron, all frostbright rooftops and smoke-choked skies, and beneath that cold grandeur moved a city fluent in judgment. Gossip traveled faster than carriage wheels, and disgrace, once whispered, was rarely outrun. In a narrow house pressed between grander brick neighbors, a young woman learned the cost of being unwanted long before the snow fell. Her mother's death had left behind not grief alone, but inconvenience, and the man who took her mother's place carried his resentment like a religion. Each year tightened the air within those walls. Each winter sharpened it. On Christmas Eve, as bells began their distant toll, the last thread of her place in that household frayed beyond repair. She had learned to make herself small in hallways and silent at tables, to accept charity as if it were fault. The stepfather's authority was not loud but relentless, expressed through withheld warmth, through glances that measured her worth and found it wanting. That night, a single cracked plate became the spark for accumulated years of quiet cruelty. His voice rose not in rage but in icy certainty, declaring her presence a moral stain, her existence an expense no longer tolerable. He spoke of righteousness as though it were shield and blade both. When the door was opened, the storm answered like a living thing. She was given no time to plead, no coat but a thin shawl, and no mercy but the certainty that mercy was not coming. The wind struck first, a brutal, wet-handed force that stole breath and balance at once. Snow tore across the street in blinding curtains, swallowing the familiar outlines of the only home she had known, however cold it had been. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a sentence passed. She did not scream. Shame had trained that reflex from her body long ago. Instead, she stepped forward because remaining was no longer permitted, and taking a step was the only choice left to her. London's grand avenues were distant dreams. Here, the narrow road became a white corridor of exile. The cold climbed steadily from her feet upward, as though measuring her for erasure. With every staggered step, memory intruded. The sound of her mother's breathing when illness had already claimed it, the brief warmth of a hand once held in protection, the promise that had ended the moment the grave was closed. The storm erased tracks almost as soon as they formed, and she realized with a slow, distant clarity that even proof of her passing would not remain. The thought did not frighten her as it should have. Fear required the belief that one would be missed. What animated her forward was not hope but the slender instinct to continue, a habit learned in years of enduring what could not be altered. Her strength failed without ceremony. It was not dramatic collapse but a gradual loosening of her will, as if the night itself whispered permission to rest. She slid against an iron railing glazed with ice and sank to her knees. Snow collected on her lashes, sealing her sight into darkness. Sound receded into a muffled echo of wind and distant bells, and even those began to thin. Somewhere in the narrowing corridor of her awareness, she understood that Christmas was being born into the world without her. The thought was oddly peaceful. Then, beneath the roar of the storm, another sound intruded, measured steps, the faint ring of metal striking stone. Light pierced the white blindness, a warm, uncertain glow swaying on the end of a lantern. A silhouette followed it, tall against the storm, anchored where everything else moved. The man bent without hesitation, his coat catching snow like black velvet scattered with stars. A gloved hand brushed snow from her face with careful slowness, as though afraid to break her. She heard a voice low and steady, speaking words she could not yet hold, only their intention. The world shifted as she was lifted, the motion gentle but decisive, and the storm's teeth fell briefly away. When consciousness returned in fragments, warmth was the first unfamiliar sensation. It seeped through her as something almost forgotten, coaxing pain into awareness and forcing breath back into her lungs. Firelight pulsed beyond heavy lids, and the scent of wood smoke and clean linen displaced the metallic tang of snow. She lay beneath blankets of weight and comfort too sudden to feel real. The room around her resolved slowly, tall windows curtained in dark velvet, carved furniture touched with gold, and the quiet authority of space designed for security. This was not rescue born of chance, it was shelter shaped by privilege. He stood near the hearth, removing his gloves as though unaccustomed to haste indoors. The Duke was younger than rumor would have granted him and older than his eyes wished to be. Responsibility had etched restraint into every movement. When he turned and saw her awake, relief crossed his face without proclamation. He approached the bed but stopped a respectful distance away, as if conscious that safety must not be mistaken for possession. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm of command tempered by something gentler. He told her she was no longer in the storm, that no one would turn her out again tonight. She searched his face with the caution of someone long trained to expect condition within kindness. Gratitude lodged in her throat, tangled with suspicion. She attempted to rise, panic urging her to prove usefulness at once, but weakness folded her back into the pillows. The infirmity embarrassed her more than the memory of the street. He lifted a hand, palm outward, a small, restrained gesture that nonetheless stilled her. It was in that quiet moment, suspended between fear and trust, that he said the words that would echo long beyond their simplicity. "You are not alone." He did not say them as a promise of forever, only as a statement of fact, and that made them harder to doubt. With daylight came the reckoning that warmth always brings. Memory returned not as comfort but as accusation. The house, the door, the snow, each detail sharpened in the safety of silk sheets. Servants moved with discreet efficiency, offering broth, clean clothes, and eyes that asked questions without speech. The Duke did not return at once, and his absence bred a new terror, that rescue might vanish with the night. When he did appear, it was with daylight behind him and an air of deliberate resolve. He asked her name as one might ask permission, not property, and listened as though the sound of it mattered. She told him only what was necessary. That she had no family willing to claim her, no coin to recommend her worth, no reputation unscarred enough to defend her place in the world. The omission of cruelty was deliberate. It felt disloyal to speak it aloud, as if suffering lost its authority once named. He did not press for more. He offered what he called temporary charity, shelter, rest, and the chance to recover her strength while the season passed. The terms were measured, proper, and externally impersonal. Yet beneath them moved a current of protection that could not be mistaken. Beyond the walls of the estate, the city would soon begin its arithmetic of rumor. A woman brought in from a storm by a duke was a story that would not stay small. Even now, servants would whisper as they worked, and neighbors would speculate as they passed the gates. The danger lay not in scandal alone, but in what scandal could undo. For her first, and for him eventually. Neither spoke of this directly, but its presence shaped the space between them with invisible pressure. She stood on a threshold where safety and exposure met, uncertain which demanded the higher price. That evening, as dusk gathered early in the depth of winter, she was moved to a smaller chamber, comfortable but plainly furnished, as if to remind both guest and household of the nature of her stay. The fire was laid, the bed prepared, and a simple meal left within reach. These were ordinary mercies, yet each carried the weight of astonishment. Alone again, she stood by the window and watched snow drift in pale sheets across the ground she might never truly belong to. Somewhere within those vast walls lived the man who had spoken to her without ownership or contempt, and the rarity of that alone unsettled her. The storm that had nearly claimed her life had passed, but its consequence had not. She lay down beneath unfamiliar blankets and felt the strangeness of permission, to rest, to breathe without vigilance, to close her eyes without calculating the cost of sleep. Outside, the bells resumed their distant song, now muffled and gentle. The night did not feel kind, but it no longer felt predatory. And yet, beneath the fragile comfort of rescue, a deeper uncertainty stirred. She had been carried out of one world and set trembling at the edge of another, where survival would demand a different, quieter courage. She woke to routine rather than rescue, the quiet grammar of ordered life settling around her with the soft authority of bells and measured steps. Morning light filtered through lace and touched the room with cautious gold, as though even the sun sought permission. A maid brought water and clothes chosen for modesty, not display, and spoke little except to say the Duke had instructed that nothing hurry her. It was kindness without spectacle, and it unsteadied her more than cruelty ever had. When she dressed, her hands trembled at the unfamiliar privilege of clean linen waiting without demand. The mirror offered a stranger she did not yet trust fully. He did not see her that morning, and the absence pressed like a test she did not know she was taking. She was shown the breakfast-room's smaller table and given tea hot enough to warm her palms into steadiness. The servant's eyes lingered with professional neutrality that could not quite conceal curiosity. By noon the estate settled into its rhythm, and she into its margins, learning which corridors were meant for passing and which for belonging. When at last the Duke entered in the afternoon, snow melting from his coat, he inclined his head to her with unforced respect. It acknowledged her presence without explaining it to the house. Their exchange was brief and exacting in its restraint. He asked after her health as one asks after weather, with genuine interest tempered by distance. She answered carefully, guarding gratitude behind composure. He told her the arrangement would be simple. She might remain through the season, no longer, and in return she would accept instructions suitable to a guest who must not become a story. The terms were precise enough to feel safe. When he rose to leave, he paused as if weighing an unspoken thought, then merely wished her strength. The door closed without ceremony, and yet the air felt altered by his passing. She stood motionless, listening inward. Days braided themselves into cautious pattern. She learned the language of the household quickly, the way a chair set askew signaled disapproval, the way a closed door meant privacy rather than exclusion when applied to others. A governess was quietly engaged to refine her reading and penmanship, and the gift of learning arrived disguised as necessity. With each small competence returned a fragment of dignity long mislaid. The Duke remained a distant presence, visible at meals only at the far end of the table, yet his influence shaped every allowance she was given. Safety, she discovered, could be administered from afar. It steadied her steps while leaving her heart uncertain. The first token was a book left on the small writing desk one morning without explanation, its pages bearing the scent of age and careful choosing. She read as if afraid the words might be recalled, and through them she traveled beyond storm and shame into worlds ordered by reason and courage. Later came a cloak, plain but warm, delivered on a tray as though it were simply another article to be accounted for. Gratitude became a discipline she practiced in silence. Each kindness widened the space within her where hope might grow, and with it grew the peril of being seen. To be noticed was to risk the story. Whispers arrived before winter fully loosened its grip. They slipped through servant corridors and into drawing rooms, distorting as they went, trading snow for suggestion and rescue for intrigue. She heard her name spoken with speculation she did not yet recognize as threat. The Duke responded not with denial but with silence, a strategy that soothed and endangered in equal measure. When visitors came, she was kept from view with a politeness that stung like rebuke. It was then she understood that shelter could also be concealment, and concealment its own quiet form of exposure. Her presence was becoming a question asked in rooms she never entered at all yet. She saw him most clearly in moments that were not meant for her, when he spoke quietly to a tenant whose rent had failed, when he listened without interruption to a steward's worry, when he stood alone at a window after a long day with the city's weight visible in his shoulders. These unguarded fragments assembled a portrait no title could finish. Once, their paths crossed unexpectedly in a corridor, and they both paused with the startled courtesy of equals. The look that passed between them carried no claim, only recognition, and that was enough to unsettle her sleep for nights after. It was a disturbance she neither welcomed nor. The season turned, and with it the arrangement grew heavier with unasked questions. Instruction gave her posture and voice, yet could not teach her how to live between gratitude and desire. At times she caught herself imagining what might happen when the season ended, and the imagining felt like a small betrayal against the rules that kept her safe. The Duke remained steadfastly proper, his distance and armor worn for both their sakes. Yet once, passing the library door, she heard him speak her name to another in a tone stripped of ceremony, and the sound of it altered her breathing. It lingered with a warmth that defied careful explanation. The scandal found its first true voice at a tea given for visiting relations, when a woman with too bright civility let fall a recollection sharpened by malice. She spoke of a girl once seen in disgrace near a burial ground, a child left with no certain name, and eyes turned describingly toward the outer rooms. The accusation was not precise enough to be proven, only poisonous enough to be believed. The Duke answered with a courtesy so exact it bordered on coldness, and in that careful reply she sensed both shield and warning. The room resumed its conversation, altered forever beneath its politeness. She felt the verdict hover without yet. That night she did not sleep, but measured the room by shadow and the cost of staying by the silence of leaving. She understood at last that the charity extended to her had begun, to gather a price neither of them had intended to name. At dawn the Duke sent for her, not with servants but with a note in his own hand, requesting her presence in the small morning room. The words were formal, yet their summons carried a gravity that quickened her pulse. As she crossed the threshold, she sensed the season tightening around its hidden hinge, and knew the next revelation would not be gentle at all. He stood by the window when she entered, city light washing the glass with pale unease, his posture held in deliberate calm. The room was smaller than the public chambers, intimate by comparison, as though truth required narrower walls. He turned at the sound of her step, and for a moment formality failed them both. Then he offered a chair and waited until she was seated before speaking. He told her plainly that rumor had begun to sour into certainty, and that goodwill alone would no longer shield her name nor his house from the slow arithmetic of society itself. She listened without interruption, hands folded so tightly the knuckles shone, absorbing each word as though it were a measured blow. When he finished, she did not plead, for pleading had never altered a verdict. Instead she spoke of departure with a steadiness that surprised even her, saying she would leave before her presence demanded more defense than he owed. The Duke's face revealed nothing at once, yet something tightened in his jaw as if restraint itself had found resistance. He said only that haste could be as dangerous as scandal, and asked her to wait for a little while. That request, modest as it was, unsettled her more than any command might have done. Waiting had always been her appointed state, yet this waiting carried the shape of choice. Days followed with an intensity disguised as calm. They met more often now, briefly yet regularly, to review the arrangements of her stay as though it were a contract continually renegotiated. In these meetings the air grew charged with what was left unsaid. She learned the cadence of his silences, and he the delicate bravery with which she refused to become bitter. Their restraint became a language both spoke fluently. In the 5th year of her quiet residence, winter returned with a familiarity that startled them both. Snow gathered without spectacle, gentle as if ashamed of its earlier violence, yet memory lent every flake a sharper weight. That seasoned the pressure upon him to marry ripened into open insistence, carried by letters heavy with lineage and advantage. Suitors' names became household knowledge, discussed with care that did not disguise ambition. She moved through days with disciplined courtesy, performing gratitude as duty while dread paced steadily beneath it. When at last he spoke of these expectations aloud, his voice held nothing. It was then that the truth she had guarded finally demanded air. On a night softened by rain rather than snow, she remained after their formal exchange and asked, with precise humility, whether she might speak without presumption. He inclined his head, and in that small allowance her composure faltered. She told him of the door shut against her, of hunger bartered for obedience, of the slow erosion that teaches a person to accept exile as deserved. Her words did not tremble, yet each carried the echo of all she had never dared utter. When she finished, silence moved between. He did not answer at once. The fire settled in the grate with a soft collapse, and the sound seemed suddenly loud. When he spoke, it was not to offer comfort but to confess a fear equally restrained. He said he had watched her for years as one might watch a light through fog, aware of its steadiness yet unsure whether to approach. He spoke of the duty that had shaped him since childhood, of the way obligation can resemble virtue while quietly eclipsing it. In his admission there was no promise, only the risky gift of being seen clearly. The understanding that followed altered the space between them with quiet violence. They stood within a truth that could not yet bear consequence. From that night forward, they practiced a more careful distance, one sharpened by what each now knew of the other. When they spoke, it was with greater gentleness, as though speech itself had learned to bruise. She felt the pull of affection deepen into something more dangerous because it was mutual and denied. He, in turn, grew more vigilant in courtesy than ever, guarding her dignity with a severity that betrayed the cost of his restraint. As winter weakened, letters arrived with increasing insistence, arranging dinners, portraits, introductions that assumed a future already chosen. She watched these preparations from the edge of rooms, learning the particular ache of being indispensable to one life and irrelevant to another. The Duke spoke less of duty now, as if naming it gave it power he wished to deny. Yet the machinery of his world advanced with patient inevitability. One afternoon he told her that arrangements for her departure were being quietly made, not in dismissal but in preservation. He said it with a gentleness that left no room for argument. That night she packed what little had become hers with motions stripped of ceremony. Each folded garment carried the weight of a season that had taught her the danger of belonging. She did not weep, for tears felt like an indulgence borrowed from a future she could no longer afford. When she finished, She sat by the unlit fire and rehearsed the words of farewell as though they were a lesson to be recited without error. Sleep came fitfully, crowded with the echo of a voice that had once told her she was not alone, and the fear that solitude. At dawn she went to the morning room to leave the key upon the table as instructed, but found him already there, coat laid across a chair as if he had never slept. The stillness between them felt heavier than any argument. He asked her why she would go without seeing him one last time when she had, in fact, come only for that. The words exposed them both. She answered that loving a door does not grant one the right to cross it. For a long moment he said nothing, and in that silence the future gathered its shape. He crossed the room before she could retreat into dignity, stopping at a distance that still respected the boundary she feared to name, and told her that the future she was preparing to surrender had already begun to break him apart. He spoke without ornament, as though stripped of every shield except truth. He said that duty had taught him how to rule land and name, but not how to rule the silence that had grown between them. He admitted that every charitable act he had extended had slowly transformed into a confession he no longer wished to hide. She listened as if balance itself depended upon stillness, aware that one careless breath might unmoor them both. When he finished, the room felt altered, as though the walls had moved a little closer to witness what followed. She reminded him of the world beyond those walls with a steadiness born of long discipline, of the cost his choice would extract from him and the suspicion it would cast upon her worth. She said that if love demanded the sacrifice of his name, then it was not love she could accept. He answered that a name preserved at the price of truth was already lost. For the first time in years his voice wavered, not with weakness, but with the effort of holding too many years of restraint in check. She stood between fear and hope as between two conflicting prayers, unsure which one carried the greater danger. When he asked her to stay, not as protection but as partner, the words settled between them with the weight of fate spoken aloud. The days that followed were shaped by a waiting far different from any she had known before. The household sensed a shift without understanding its source, as though the air itself carried rumor before any tongue dared to form it. Invitations arrived with the same insistence as before, yet the Duke deferred them all with an authority that did not explain itself. She moved through corridors with a new awareness that eyes lingered not with curiosity only but with calculation. Each moment alone seemed borrowed. When night came, she lay awake against the sound of distant carriages and wondered how courage learned to take form in flesh. The reckoning arrived not through confrontation alone but through ceremony. A winter ball long planned for reasons of courtesy and alliance could not be postponed without provocation, and to attend was to invite judgment into a room prepared to magnify it. Preparations unfolded with rigorous polish, gowns pressed, chandeliers lit, floors swept into gleaming readiness. On the evening itself, she was given a dress whose simplicity was its own declaration, neither disguise nor challenge. When she descended the staircase into the blaze of candlelight below, the hush that followed was not silence but recalculation. She stood with a calm that startled even her, sensing the tension ripple outward in widening circles. He met her at the foot of the steps with the composure of a man who had already stepped beyond retreat. Together they moved into the current of voices and music, and every bow, every polite inquiry tested the integrity of his resolve. The expected candidates for his attention were present, adorned with the careful ease of entitlement, and their surprise was the first quiet victory she witnessed in his defense. The dance began as custom required, pairs forming under the patient authority of tradition. When the Duke claimed her hand before any other could, the room inhaled as one body. The gesture was neither dramatic nor hidden, and precisely in that restraint lay its challenge. They moved as they had always spoken, with attentiveness that revealed its power only to those who knew how to look. Around them the room softened into blur, color and motion receding before a clarity neither had dared imagine so publicly before. The music carried them through step and measure with a steadiness that steadied courage itself. She felt the eyes upon them without shame now, for shame required secrecy, and secrecy had passed its last appeal. When the dance ended, the Duke did not release her at once, and in that pause the space between rumor and truth briefly collapsed. The confrontation arrived through a voice practiced in command, a relative whose authority rested on lineage older than debate. He questioned the propriety of the scene with a civility sharpened by warning, casting her presence as misunderstanding and the Duke's conduct as youthful misjudgment. The charge echoed through the circle that had formed without invitation. Before she could withdraw into the familiar refuge of quiet surrender, the Duke answered. He named her not as guest, not as charity, but as the woman he intended to marry. He did so without raise of voice or flourish of defiance, granting the declaration the dignity of certainty rather than the heat of rebellion. The room answered with a sound not quite gasp and not quite murmur, a collective recalibration of social arithmetic that had not expected to be forced so openly into revision. Faces reflected astonishment, doubt, calculation, and, in a few, an unwilling respect. The relative withdrew with a stiffness that promised conflict to come, yet for that moment words failed him. The Duke turned back to her as though no other presence remained, and asked her, with the same calm that had once spoken rescue into her life, whether she would choose him freely. The choice, when she gave it, was quiet, and therefore unassailable. The weeks that followed tested the endurance of their decision with a severity masked as propriety. Letters arrived that questioned, advised, and warned in turns. Some doors closed with cultivated courtesy, others opened with cautious curiosity. She endured each response with a patience honed in harder seasons, yet now it was met not with isolation but with an alliance that steadied her steps. He navigated the resistance with a composure that transformed challenge into negotiation rather than retreat. There were nights when the cost of their stand weighed visibly upon him, and she learned then that strength was not the absence of doubt but the refusal to be ruled by it. Preparation for their union moved forward not as triumph but as deliberate commitment. The estate adjusted its habits around a future that no longer fit the oldest expectations, and in that adjustment she felt the first true tremor of belonging. She studied the responsibilities that would soon be hers with an attention that sought not display but competence. When she faltered beneath the weight of consequence, he answered not with reassurance alone but with trust, granting her space to become rather than merely to be chosen. The intimacy that grew between them now carried no secrecy, yet it deepened rather than diminished in the full light of consent. Winter returned as it always did, yet its approach held no threat this time, only memory and comparison. On the evening of their wedding, snow gathered softly against the dark, as though the storm of years ago had returned in apology rather than in fury. The church glowed with candlelight and restrained celebration, attended by those who chose presence not for spectacle but for witness. As she walked forward, the echoes of exile and endurance moved beside her like shadows finally released. When she reached him, his expression held not possession but recognition, as though the long journey of restraint had found its answer in arrival rather than claim. They stood together beneath vows spoken with clarity born of ordeal, and when the final words bound them, the sound of approval rose not as thunder but as steady, human affirmation. Outside, bells answered the silence that followed with peals that scattered across the snow-covered city. She felt the cold once more when they stepped into the night, yet it no longer pierced. His hand found hers with a natural ease of a gesture no longer forbidden. The storm had once written her ending in ice, and now winter itself framed a beginning carved in warmth. Later, when the celebration softened into quiet, they returned to the estate that had first sheltered despair and now received them as partners. The fire burned high in the same hearth where she had once awakened uncertain of permission. She stood there alone for a moment before he joined her, feeling the past loosen its final hold. He told her then that the words he had spoken to her in the snow had not been charity but instinct, a truth he had only learned to name through years of denial. She answered that she had carried those words as one carries breath, not for hope but for survival. The night settled into stillness, and the city beyond its windows continued its patient turning, unaware that fate had been revised within a single life. She moved through the rooms now without calculation, no longer tracing the distance between margin and center, for the distinction had ceased to command her steps. When she looked back upon the path that had led her here, it did not appear as miracle alone but as the long consequence of endurance finally met by choice. The cold that had once exiled her had become the witness of her return. In the quiet that followed, she understood at last that rescue was not the opposite of exile but its answer, written not in spectacle but in the slow courage of being seen and not cast out again. The world had not grown kinder in an instant, nor had judgment vanished from its streets and drawing-rooms, yet within the narrow compass of their union a different law now held. She rested her head against his shoulder and allowed herself, for once, not to be vigilant. The storm that had torn her from one life had delivered her to another, not as accident but as passage, and the warmth that held her now was not borrowed, but finally, irrevocably, her own.